The tragedy of Carrie White doesn't begin with telekinesis. It begins with blood. Not pig's blood in a bucket. Not even the blood in the showers of Ewan High School on that fateful day Carrie discovered the so-called Curse of Eve. It begins in the summer of 1959, when a gunshot thunders above the rowdy music of the Jolly Roadhouse. Carrie White's grandfather is the owner of this profitable business located on the outskirts of the small town of Moughton, Maine. It's likely that over the years this well-to-do proprietor had seen his fair share of ruffians, bikers, and drug-addicted fiends. That night, however, was his last. A bullet took his life. Carrie's mother, Margaret Brigham, was nearly 30 at the time and still living at home. She was deeply affected by her father's bloody murder and immersed herself in prayer services at her local Baptist church. Margaret fostered extreme views on sin and sexual immorality. Simply put, sex was seen as evil, even between a husband and a wife. Her views became so extreme that she eventually left the Baptist church in order to worship from home, conducting her own biblical analysis and deviations from the religious text. When Margaret's widowed mother remarried, the daughter condemned the relationship, labeling their household an abode of wickedness. However, in September of 1960, Margaret met Ralph White. She finally moved out of her parents' home and married on March 23, 1962. Only 3 weeks after the nuptials, Mrs. Margaret White was admitted to the hospital. Her mother and stepfather weren't quite certain, but they speculated that Margaret suffered from a miscarriage, and if that was the case, that would mean that Margaret and Ralph failed to live without the sin of intercourse. Even in marriage, Margaret claimed that sexual activity with her husband would be an affront to God, and that the only way she would bear a child would be through divine intervention. Yet on September 21st, 1962, Margaret gave birth to a little girl. By then, Margaret had apparently been seduced by her husband Ralph at least once, and the husband had subsequently been killed in a construction accident. One cannot help but wonder, given the strange nature of this case, as to whether this construction site incident was truly an accident. Perhaps Margaret, feeling shameful for giving in to her physical desires, somehow took revenge. Perhaps she killed Ralph and made it look like an accident. Or perhaps Ralph was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. Regardless, Margaret was now without a husband, and little Carrie was born without a father. The neighbors of Margaret White considered her a religious nut. She publicly shamed people around her, threatening the wrath of God, all the while her daughter Carrie was being emotionally and physically abused. Not to mention, Margaret refused to teach the girl anything about human anatomy other than it was disgusting. Case in point, Margaret referred to breasts as dirty pillows. At the age of 3, Carrie witnessed Estelle Horan, a female neighbor, sunbathing topless. This awakened a natural curiosity within the child, and when Margaret discovered their interaction, she flew into a rage, one that drew the attention of the entire neighborhood, and not just because of her self-righteous ranting. After Mrs. White dragged Carrie into the house, something inexplicable happened. The weather rapidly changed. There was a downpour of hail, and then rocks began falling from the sky. Hundreds of rocks, but they didn't pummel the entire neighborhood. The rocks only landed on the property of Margaret White, pelting and damaging her roof. Within the house, a calamity is heard. An enormous mahogany table is thrown through the window. Onlookers claim that it would have been impossible for Margaret to have thrown such a massive piece of furniture. And they were right. Margaret White didn't throw the table, and she did not summon the rainstorm of stones. Her daughter did those things, and she did them with the incredible power of her mind. Were there other instances of telekinesis throughout Carrie White's childhood? It is difficult to say given the reclusive nature of this disturbed family. Some experts believe that there must have been ESP events leading up to the tragedy that would take place. However, other journalists speculate that it wasn't until the dawn of Carrie's menstrual cycle that was when the telekinetic abilities truly began to blossom. It is interesting to note that Carrie's first period came about in a very public and a very traumatic way. Because of her mother's refusal to teach her anything truthful about human reproduction, Carrie had no idea what to expect. The bleeding began while she was showering in the girls' locker room, and this unpopular 16-year-old feared that she was bleeding to death. Add to that a multitude of mean-spirited girls chanting "Plug it up," all the while pelting her with tampons, and you have a horrific moment in a flash of telekinetic reflex. Carrie makes the light bulbs explode, and she does this with her mind. Of course, no one realizes this yet. No one knows that Carrie White, the butt of everyone's joke, the scapegoat of you in high school, is harboring an incredible power, a power that when unleashed can wrought unspeakable destruction. As her classmates torment this confused young woman known as Carrie White, no one imagines the mayhem that will be unleashed in a matter of weeks. But they will, constant reader. They will find out soon enough. Thank you for listening to our first installment of the Stephen King Book Club. Next week we'll be diving into the themes and the writing style of the first 50 pages of Carrie. In the meantime, if you've started reading this book or if you've read it already, we would love to know your opinions about Stephen King's Carrie. So please leave a comment and like and subscribe, and we will see you soon, constant reader.